we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right.
Despite constitutional guarantees, American civil rights and liberties are constantly in danger of violation, whether by individuals, corporations, or government institutions. Regardless of whether personal prejudices or national security concerns lie at the root of these violations, challenging them and holding wrongdoers accountable is imperative for the sake of the constitutional integrity and the preservation of the American way. Trial lawyers advocate for awareness, the truth, and a person's right to know. They believe that in the absence of the truth, all of us stand helpless to defend ourselves, our families, our health, and our way of life. Oftentimes, we don't think about or worry about or understand what is happening to another until it happens to us. Deceits have no boundaries. Disease doesn't recognize the color of our skin or our political party's affiliation. When it comes to cover-ups and false allegations by agencies of the state and the federal government, there is not a soul amongst us who does not have a cringing fear of their overwhelming, awesome power. It is at these times that we need experienced and dedicated trial lawyers, the warriors in the courtroom, who are willing to battle for us tooth and nail in the halls of justice to protect our cherished way of life. Such a call for justice happened on February 10th, 1994, when the state of Wyoming Department of Family Services revoked Connie and Roland Nation's daycare center license in Riverton, Wyoming. Based on totally false allegations, unsubstantiated by any evidence whatsoever, they caused the nation's extensive economic losses, the loss of their business, public censure, and a personal embarrassment. Today, the Insider Exclusive goes behind the headlines to investigate how Vance Countryman, the nation's lawyer, proved that the Wyoming Department of Family Services wrongfully and falsely accused the nations of this indignant injustice and received a public apology from the state of Wyoming in addition to a well-deserved, justified financial settlement. Hi, I'm Steve Murphy, and this is the Insider Exclusive, live from Lander, Wyoming, at the law firm of Vance Countryman. It's my great pleasure to introduce Vance Countryman to the show. Welcome to the show, Vance.
Thank you.
We have an interesting case here where the government used its awesome power against a couple that was just doing nothing. And we're going to get into the actual story first. But your practice consists of representing little guys, don't they?
Absolutely. We represent almost exclusively individuals or mom and pop kinds of businesses.
What made you decide that that's the kind of career you wanted with your life?
I guess because I don't fit in corporate America. I honestly, I don't have the right attitude, mentality, setting, whatever you want to call it. But what I do have is a great desire to take care of people, to serve people. And so when we interview folks and we find cases where we see that people have been wronged, we do everything in our power to help those people right a wrong.
In other words, when you see an injustice being done, you want to make it right.
And let me tell you, justice is hard to find in this country anymore. Yeah. So that's exactly what we do.
I want our audience to know that when I say you want to make it right, you not only walk the talk, but you put your money where your mouth is, right?
It's our money that goes into these cases. And frankly, if injured people had to finance their own litigation, they would never see the courthouse steps. They would never even get started. I mean, just to file a suit in federal court, it costs $300.
Really?
And that's not a huge sum of money, but I'll tell you, to somebody who's out of work, they've been injured, they're behind in their rent or their house payment. I guess because I don't fit in corporate America, I honestly, I don't have the right.
Do you think judges, when they hear a case, where the defendant, let's say a corporation, and they have conducted themselves in an egregious manner, outrageous conduct, do you think that they are incensed, a judge, incensed by the behavior of the defendant?
Those people, honestly, I think right or wrong. I think that's why there's such a push. Absolutely.
You want to make it right.
And let me tell you, justice is hard to find in this country anymore. So that's exactly what we do.
Corporations accountable. I think that's the whole push behind tort reform and behind legislating caps on damages.
It's our money that goes into these cases. And
judges are humans too, and when they see when there's something that's
frankly, if
egregious that's happening,
injured people
and that the
had to
injuries
finance
are
their own litigation,
huge.
they would never see the courthouse steps.
want
They
to
would
do the
never
right thing
even
as
get
well.
started.
And so
I mean, just to
what-
file a
what
suit in federal
happens
court,
then
it costs
in corporate
$300.
America
And that's not a huge sum of money, but I'll tell you, to somebody who's out of work, they've been injured, they're behind.
When
in
any
rent,
medical
or
student
house
attends
payment,
medical school,
they don't know how it is
they
they're gonna
are
pay
taught
for
the
their groceries.
Hippocratic
They don't have
oath,
$300
which is to try to
pay.
preserve at all costs, if possible, the life, the comfort of a human being. When any student is in law school, aren't they all taught that they should seek justice, follow the law, do the right thing? Or isn't everybody told this?
I think
Honestly, I think they are, and I think that's why there's such a push to legislate scenarios where even judges can't hold or jurors can't hold corporations accountable. I think that's the whole push behind tort reform and behind legislating caps on damages, because judges are humans too, and when they see when there's something that's egregious that's happened and that the injuries are huge, they want to do the right thing as well. And so what happens then is that corporate America exerts its influence in Congress or even at the state level to try and rein in their exposure.
Because every time I think about that, these best lawyers that go to work for corporate law firms, I'm trying to think, do they have a conscience at night? Do they think this was the wrong thing to do, to cheat this person out of a just settlement?
Well, I think that I sleep better at night.
Are they all taught that they should seek justice?
And I'm glad I do what I do.
Follow the law. Let's talk about the Wyoming Department of Family Services and the case that we're going to talk about here today, which is a daycare center that was owned by Connie and Roland Nations. Tell us about that case.
Well, I think the first thing a person needs to understand is the overwhelming power that the Department of Family Services has. Once again, the legislature is so concerned that each one of these cases be investigated, and it ought to be investigated, that it creates a carte blanche immunity for anybody who reports these and investigates these. So you could have someone who turns you in for child abuse or child neglect, it being completely malicious, no basis for the allegation, and yet they have complete immunity. In fact, you can't even find out the name of the person who reported the incident.
I understand in this case, a 12-year-old girl reported an incident.
That's what we understand, that a 12-year-old girl who the nations would not allow their daughter, who at the time I think she was 5, maybe she was young, 4, 5, 6, they would not let her go over to this 12-year-old's house and play. And so one day when the nation's daughter was getting off the bus, this 12-year-old called into DFS and said that they had seen Mr. Nations knock the 5-year-old to the ground, kick her repeatedly, and grab her and throw her in the truck and then go home.
Wouldn't it seem that an adult receiving this phone call would question the veracity of a child making this accusation?
Well, immunity for anybody who reports these and investigates these. So you could have someone who turns you in for child abuse or child neglect, it being completely malicious, no basis for the allegation, and yet they have complete immunity. In fact, you can't even find out the name of the person who reported the incident.
I understand in this case, a 12-year-old girl reported an incident.
That's what we understand, that a 12-year-old girl who the nations would not allow their daughter, who at the time I think she was 5, maybe she was young, 4, 5, 6, they would not let her go over to this 12-year-old's house and play. And so one day when the nation's daughter was getting off the bus, this 12-year-old called into DFS and said that they had seen Mr. Nations knock the 5-year-old to the ground, kick her repeatedly, and grab her and throw her in the truck and then go home.
Would it seem that an adult receiving this phone call would question the veracity of a child making this accusation?
Well, you have to remember,
And he, by the way,
this is
was how old at
legislative
this
wisdom
time?
again. They have to investigate every report.
You
They're
don't find
required
too
by
many
law.
violent
So
grandfathers
they take the
beating
report.
people.
Now, here's where the intelligence factor comes in my mind. They go to the nation's home. This little girl is sitting in a high chair, eating, I think it was Cheerios, something like that, and she was watching cartoons. The nations cooperated
So they
completely.
come to their
The
house,
DFS
and that very
came in.
first time they tell him he has to
Took
leave.
the little girl into a bedroom. They removed her shirt and her pants. There's no marks, no scuffs, no red marks. There's nothing to indicate that that little girl had been exposed to trauma at all. Law enforcement shows up, and under Wyoming law, the only person who can take a
While they're
child out of a
supposedly
home is a
investigating.
police officer. DFS can't do that. So the police officer shows up, he looks at the little girl, he sees what's going on, he leaves. But that's not good enough for the Department of Family Services. They tell Mr. Nations that if he doesn't leave the residence right then, that they're
And
going
what
to take the little girl
level,
into
what
custody
position of this
and
DFS
separate her from her
organization was this person? Just a counselor, an
in his
investigator?
mid-70s. They have a team called Child Protective Services, and they have people whose sole job is to investigate allegations of
Right.
abuse and neglect. So it isn't like this person's untrained or unskilled. In fact, when you look at how this case carried out, you can see the level of sophistication that was used against the nations. That there isn't any question in my mind that the DFS workers knew to the precise moment what it was they intended to do and how they intended to treat the nations.
So Roland is in a hotel for a week.
That's right.
They're following all the instructions. What happens then?
Well, they meet with Yvonne Rice, who was the caseworker, and she's the one who made the comment that they would take the little girl out of the home. And she says, listen, let's just enter an agreement, you do some counseling, and everything will be fine.
Right.
So about 3 days pass, 4 days. The nations go down to the DFS office and meet with Yvonne Rice, where she has an agreement prepared.
Standard form.
Standard form. This is a fill in the blank kind of form, and then at the bottom it has a space where they can set out what each of the terms are, because they would vary from case to case. Mm-hmm. The nations both sign that document, slide it back over to Ms. Rice.
They don't really read it.
Well, I think they scan it, but I don't
Yeah.
think they appreciate the nature of what it is they're signing.
Yeah.
But from the DFS's position, that is an admission of abuse. By signing that document and agreeing to do those things, they've admitted, by that document, they've admitted abuse. Mm-hmm. Now, the ramification of that is they can't maintain their daycare license.
So when did they find this out?
Within a breath. Because when they slid the document across the table,
Right.
Yvonne Rice slid over to them a document revoking their daycare license.
So she knew what was coming.
At
She
the-
didn't tell them.
At the onset, when they
Yeah.
walked in the room, It was already set that they were going to take the nation's daycare license.
And it's important to understand that their daycare license was their only
Standard
source of
form.
income for a couple in their mid-70s.
Fill-in-the-blank kind of form, and then at the bottom.
Raising a child that they didn't have to raise. They took this child on because they wanted to give her a better
What each
life.
of the terms are.
And now their license is revoked right then and there.
Both sign that document. Slide it back over to Ms. Rice.
Not only does it disrupt.
Well, I think they scan it, but I don't think they appreciate
They
that
must have been shocked.
they're signing. But from the DFS's position, that is an admission of abuse. By signing that document and agreeing to do those things, they've admitted, by that document, they've admitted abuse. Now, the ramification of that is
Mr. Nations, when he got that letter,
they can't maintain their daycare license. So
they find this out?
Listen,
within
let me stay out.
a breath,
I'll stay
because
out of
when
the
they
home.
slid the document across the
Live at
table,
home,
Yvonne Rice slid over to them a document revoking
be in
their daycare license.
Did they take the child?
At the onset,
That's kind of odd. They revoked the license but didn't take the child. Wouldn't the child be more important than the license?
daycare license.
Well, from their perspective, I guess they must have thought, well, I can't do anything about this one, but we're gonna.
Raising a child.
Raising a child that they didn't have to raise,
they took this child on because they wanted to give her a better life. So how did this case come to you?
Well,
License is revoked right
I received a phone call.
At that very moment, they can no longer open their daycare business. So not only does it disrupt the nations, it was devastating to the nations.
At the moment,
Every family whose child is in that daycare now has no place for daycare. I mean, the nations literally had a list of every person who wrote letters and talked about how.
So in other words, the government agency comes in and said, this is the way it's going to be.
And there's no appeal.
And there's
Mr.
no appeal.
Nations, when he got that letter,
Unless you go to court.
when that was slid back to him, he told them,
Yes.
Listen,
there is a mechanism
let me
to
stay
have
out.
district
I'll stay out of the home. They
agency
said, no.
decision.
You live in that home.
I referred that to a
You've
friend of
been
mine.
found to be an abuser. You can't be in the home and be in and maintain a daycare
And
upstairs.
That aspect of it. And we
No,
were together
they did
maybe
not.
That's kind of odd.
6 months
They
after
revoked
that,
the
and
license
we were
but
talking
didn't take
about
the
case,
child.
and I said,
Wouldn't
"You
the child be
realize
more important than the
That's
license?
the perfect civil rights case.
Well, from their perspective, I guess they must have thought,
Well, they denied him
well,
due process. There was no
we can't do
appeal.
anything
There's
about
no
this one,
way
but we're
to
gonna
review what
we're gonna
had
save
happened
all
to
the
nation.
other,
They have-
30,
that's
40
they
kids,
have
however
a
many kids were in that
fundamental right to
daycare.
have
So how did
that
this
kind of
case-
agency action.
Well, I received a phone call from Connie, and she was just, I wouldn't say hysterical, but I mean, she was distraught.
And
At the
meanwhile, what are
moment,
they doing? 6 months later?
my caseload was such I couldn't do anything about it, but they wanted to appeal the decision, and in that particular
Right.
case, there was no mechanism for you to seek a review of the decision by the Department of Family Services.
So in other words, the government agency
$1 billion
comes in and said,
loans.
this is the way it's going to be.
But see, the nation
And there's no
didn't get
appeal.
that
And
same
there's no
benefit.
appeal.
Right.
They have the same problems though.
Well,
because
when the daycare shuts down, their cash flow stops. Now they can't service their payments on their daycare and their foodstuffs that they had for lunch. That gets used up, and they don't have the money to refinance it. So by the time that the civil rights case was brought, they're completely shut down. They don't have the money to reopen because they've used that money living because there's no cash flow. And Congress isn't coming there to help them.
So now you're going to handle this case as a civil rights case. What do you do first?
Well, the good thing about civil rights is that we don't have to go through governmental claim procedures. We don't have to give notice and send letters and do all that. We can just pull the trigger and sue them and get going. And that's what we did.
Taking on the Wyoming Department of Family Services is like taking on any governmental agency.
Well, it is. And here's the fun part. Because, see, they all think they're bulletproof because they have complete immunity. They can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
Well, the good thing about a civil rights case, sometimes it's referred to as a 1983 action, states cannot frustrate that federal purpose. When the daycare shuts down, their cash flow stops. Now they can't service their payments on their daycare and their foodstuffs that they had for lunch.
So you filed this case in federal court.
Actually, we filed in state court. The 11th Amendment prevents us from filing suit against the state in federal court. So we tried this case, or it was going to be tried in front of Judge Rogers.
Now, I have read a lot of complaints against the Department of Family Services in a lot of different states. Is this a common way of are there a lot of lawsuits filed against the Department of Family Services?
Honestly, this is the only case I know of that was brought this way until about a year and a half ago. I met a lawyer out of Oregon, and he does a great deal of litigation against their state Department of Family Services or their equivalent under this kind of an act. The truth is, this is the only mechanism that I'm aware of that will allow you relief for misconduct by the Department of Family Services.
Do they hire outside law firms?
No, they have the biggest law firm in the state, and that would be the Wyoming Attorney General's office.
So you're up against the Attorney General's office?
That's right.
And what is their attitude when you file the suit?
They had a pretty seasoned lawyer. He was very set on getting to the facts of what happened.
He wanted to know the truth.
He wanted to know the truth, and it was, frankly, it was really refreshing. It is only one of two cases where I have ever seen a defendant apologize, and they publicly apologized.
This is the Wyoming Department of Family Services issued an apology. Was that a written apology?
It was. It was published in our local newspaper.
Okay, and what else were the nations able to get? Because they've suffered economically here.
They were able to get a settlement of I think it was $150,000 for the time that their business was shut down.
Were they able to reopen their business?
You know, I'm not sure if they did or they didn't.
Is there also a price put on the fact that I'm sure there's a lot of people, and you see this when you bring a case to trial, that a juror often people think that if you're not guilty, the government wouldn't have charged you, right? So maybe it'd be difficult for them to get their business going again.
It's a sad state of affairs that accused people they had a pretty seasoned lawyer. He was very set on getting to the facts of what happened.
He wanted to know the truth.
He wanted to know the truth, and it was, frankly, it was really refreshing. It is only one of two cases where I have ever seen a defendant apologize, and they publicly apologized.
This is the Wyoming Department of Family Services issued it. How long did it take to get this resolved?
Well, the case went on for nearly a year. And
so
of course,
6 months, they don't have any income.
Plus a year.
Plus a year.
That's right.
So they're finding it difficult to survive because they're 70 years old.
Well, and this is true in every case where you have someone that's injured. Yeah. Those people have to figure out a way to survive while the litigation's going. You know, you see some newspaper article that says couple recovers $2-3 million. Well, they may have lost their home, their car, they're virtually destitute, and how do you replace somebody's home? They may have lived in that home for 15 years and they're halfway through their mortgage and now they can't make that payment. These kinds of things are devastating to people, and people, I don't know that they ever recover. I don't know that even if it's a complete and full recovery, if they ever are able to overcome what has been done to them by the wrongful conduct of the defendant.
As a result of this case, in the state of Wyoming, have policies been put in effect where investigations have to be double-checked so this doesn't repeat itself again?
Well, the case went on for nearly a year.
Within the Department of Family Services?
In the Department of Family Services.
No longer is the Gestapo saying, that's it, and no appeal.
I remember we subpoenaed a copy of the file from the Department of Family Services, and we found some inter-office, I don't know if they called it email then, but we found some inter-office communications, and one of the supervisors says, "What are you doing? You're going to get us sued." And he's carrying on about how this was handled and how this was taken care of.
This was a manager.
And this was a manager.
Yeah.
And I remember his name was Rick Breedlove, and we took his deposition, and we handed him those. Now the irony is, we didn't get those when the first time we got the record. See, those things were not included.
How did you get him later on then?
Well, we made him bring the file to his deposition, and he just grabbed the file and brought it. Well, it just so happens that the person who went through the file to answer the discovery was one of the defendants that was named in the case. And so those things somehow weren't produced, but we did get them. when he brought the whole file because he didn't know what he was bringing. I shouldn't say that. I don't know what he knew.
Yeah. By the way, whenever we do a show like this and we're talking about the Department of Family Services, there are a lot of good people that do a lot of good things in these agencies. What this case is all about and what this issue is all about is those bad apples that work within a governmental agency.
I don't know if they call it email then,
heretofore had had total immunity against anything they did without any regard for the economic or the emotional toll that it took on the person that they targeted.
How this was taken care of, and this is a manager. And I remember taking, his name was Rick Breedlove, and we took his deposition, and we handed him those. Now the irony is, we didn't get those when the first time we got the record. See, those things were not included. Well, we made him bring the file to his deposition, and he just grabbed the file and brought it. Well, it just so happens that the person who went through the file to answer the discovery was one of the defendants that was named in the case. And so those things somehow weren't produced, but we did get them when he brought the whole file.
Do you find, and do you have a lot of cases, if you have a lot of cases where the government has made false accusations against private individuals, civil rights kind of cases?
We have a case right now, and we are going to be filing suit in that case where a young man was beaten by some officers. They came into his home in the middle of the night. He was in bed, and he was awoken, and when you read the police reports and then you interview the neighbors and you see the various things, there are things in the police report that are just simply missing. And anytime people have that kind of power, it is always a strong likelihood that at some point that power will be abused.
Your philosophy when you take a case, and I think this is important for our audience to know, is that you are willing to do everything possible to take it to trial to seek justice, correct?
Absolutely. When we take a case, you know, you see the new MMA fighting stuff on TV, and they go in the octagon. Baby, when we go to trial, we're getting in the octagon, and we're not going to hold any punches. We're going to do everything that's ethically and legally available to us to find out the truth.
As a matter of record, the gal, the DFS worker, who unilaterally made a decision to revoke the nation's license, was anything done against her?
The answer to that is no. The settlement came from the state. And there was never any recourse to her. And it wasn't unilateral. Her supervisor signed on the documents as well. So she had discussed this with her supervisor, and her supervisor was named a party to litigation.
Right. Well, I'm glad you were able to handle their case. We need many more lawyers like yourself to handle cases like that, because the little guy does need representation. And I want to thank you very much for being on the program. Thanks for watching. You can get more information about our guest and the issues at insiderexclusive.com.